Geithner and a New Deal.
Maybe. I guess the one thing I'd say is one of the things they cannot do is go back to the New Deal. One of the things they're talking about is building roads, building bridges. Well, sometimes it takes 80 months to get an infrastructure project actually going. The amount of money spent in the first couple of years in infrastructure, minuscule. So the one thing I'd say to them, think about the new economy. This is a human capital economy. Think about relationships and not roads. And so if I were designing employment plans,
exactly?
Right, if I were designing employment plans, things I would think about is do some road building, build some schools, that's fine. But think about national service. Think about how you're going to build relationships. Think about how you're going to build federal money to create communities that actually employ a lot of people in a service sector sort of economy. To me, the way they're talking now, they're doing a lot of reading about Harry Hopkins. I would spend a lot more time thinking about how am I going to build relationships using service, building communities.
I really think, respectfully, I disagree. It's a kind of a straw man. I mean, I think you have to do all of the above. I think the hit to the economy is so serious. Contrary to the usual belief, you can get infrastructure programs going pretty quickly, and by giving relief to state and local government, you get help on the way instantaneously. Right now, state and local governments are laying off people. They're deferring projects. They're cutting health and education. If the government cuts a check to state and local governments to the tune of $100, $150 billion, not one of those layoffs have to occur.
Frees up some of their money as well.
Sure, so it may take some time. Let me just finish. It may take some time to create new jobs, but at least we can prevent layoffs from occurring in state and local governments, and you can get infrastructure programs going within 6 months.
I'm not against it. I'd just say they're talking about, as Chuck Schumer did, $500 to $700 billion. We can agree on state aid. I do agree on that. The things we know work. State aid works. Food stamps works. Extending unemployment, which they've done, that works. That clearly works to stimulate the economy. It's actually very hard to spend $700 billion quickly. And what if you got a Tiddlywinks Hall of Fame, they're going to fund that. They're going to fund everything.
They do that anyway, under earmarks and all the rest. I mean, what you're proposing is reactionary liberalism. That is, whatever exists, double down on it. Before we go into a New Deal, can we just acknowledge the first New Deal didn't work? That is, the biggest collapse in industrial production in history occurred in 1937, 8 years after the stock market collapse of 1929, 5 years into the New Deal.
Well, it is really another of the myths that conservatives cling to now, that the New Deal did not work. And it's really, as every sort of myth of conservatism has exploded. Whether it is the fact that the Leave Us Alone coalition, of Grover Norquist, or the tax and spend, the slogans, those are not being repeated anymore. So now we're going back to the New Deal, or as Senator Shelby said, we're not going to throw money at problems. I mean, I agree with Robert that it's got to be both. It's got to be major infrastructure, public investments, but also the call to service that David talked about has to be central to the Obama administration. He's talked about it a lot in the campaign. It's going to be a big part of the inauguration, I understand. And it's kind of basically a demand to the American people to give of themselves, to help others, and not just to expect government to do everything.
Bob, you've got to refute George Will.
Yeah,
you're saying you want to get in there.
I want to put in a kind word for reactionary liberalism. I mean, there are things like a 21st century electric grid and water and sewer systems that haven't been repaired since the end of the 19th century, and world-class internet access. On the infrastructure front. On the human service front, we ought to have universal pre-kindergarten. We ought to have universal child care at professional wages so that jobs that can't be exported pay a living wage. That's services. That's human services. We need to do both things. And the economy is cratering at such a rapid rate that we have to spend serious money. Now, on the question of whether the New Deal worked, Doris Goodwin said to me the other day, don't look at the Roosevelt of 1933. Look at the Roosevelt of 1941, 1942. The New Deal got us halfway out of the Depression. And it was Roosevelt's effort to balance the budget in 1937 that caused the downturn. But in 1941-42, we converted to a wartime footing, and unemployment disappeared. And the deficit went as high as 28% of GDP. Now, I'm not saying the deficit has to go that high. But Doris's point was, look at the auto conversion in 1941, 1942, where they shut the lines, they retooled, they started making planes and tanks and produced aircraft and weaponry at a rate that the world had never seen. We could do that with fuel-efficient cars as the price of the
And
auto
that's what we
bailout.
keep hearing President-elect Obama talk about green jobs.
Yeah, that's my fear, actually. That's not a New Deal. That's a 5-year plan. If we're going to, in fixing, say, the auto industry, if we're going to have an auto czar who apparently is smart enough to know how to reorganize these companies, apparently smart enough to know which green technology, apparently, I guess he's going to be designing carburetors. And that is the danger, that we somehow start running the economy from Washington, and it's
Aren't we doing that right now?
Well,
With
we're
TARP?
spending out a lot of money in TARP, which doesn't seem to have worked, by the way. But fixing the finance, or at least shoveling money at the financial sector, is one thing. That's a public utility. We've got a
public utility.
Well, I guess that's a metaphor. Well, we've got to stabilize that system. My problem is that I'm all for rescuing Detroit if somehow some genius can figure out how to do it. But the problem is getting politics involved. And if we have congressmen, a president designing an auto bailout, there's just going to be political fixes which are going to screw it all up.
The 535 automobile engineers in Capitol Hill have been designing cars for years, telling us what fuel they ought to have, what safety standards, how you can't, counting against your CAFE standards, your fuel economy standards, you can't count the cars you import from your factories in Europe because the United Auto Workers doesn't run those factories in Europe, which may have something to do with why they're producing those cars. What we're doing in the automobile industry is a classic example of this. We're going to take 5 entities, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, the United Auto Workers, and the federal government, and get them into business competing against America's flourishing automobile industry that employs 113,000 people down south, Americans making them cars to sell to Americans.
First of all, look at what has happened so far. You've had the auto industry spending millions of dollars every year lobbying so that the government can keep giving them the SUV loopholes, the massive tax credits for SUV gas-guzzling cars that basically got them to this place. So government has been an enabler of what has happened. Now what we are asking is not for the government to run the auto industry, but for the current CEOs to definitely leave. There is no way that the people who brought the auto industry to this point are going to be the ones that rescue it. Bring in new leadership. And there is no question, David, that we know what to do. I mean, it's been done by Toyota. It's been done by many companies, the fuel-efficient cars that they're producing and that the public is buying without having to spend billions of dollars in advertising, as Detroit did, to convince us that we need those gas-guzzling SUVs for years now.
And the automakers argue, David, that they're actually farther along in innovation than their competitors. They just haven't been able to get the cars to the market.
Well, the analysts I read, they say that we just need a bridge loan. The analysts I read, and I'm not an expert in the auto industry, but it seems to me there is a consensus among the analysts they're not far along. Or they've made progress, but it's going to take more than a bridge loan. It takes fundamental restructuring. Restructuring may be the management, but where are you going to get a new management? It takes restructuring of the political culture. And the question is, how is that restructuring most likely to appear or go along positively? It seems to me the least political process is the way to do that. And Chapter 11 was designed for that.
You know, if anyone has seen the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car, Detroit had a production car in 1996 that was a plug-in electric car. And they killed it because they weren't making enough money. They recalled and crushed every single one of these that was on the road. These are really dumb guys. You know, it's not just that they took corporate jets to Washington to plead for a bailout. They've made one dumb decision after another. And, George, with all due respect, you can't blame this on the government. CAFE standards is one of the few public policies that actually prodded them to make fuel-efficient cars that they didn't want to make. This is a really tough question. You need to get rid of these executives, and you need to have a plan that is jointly developed so that Detroit can make competitive cars that are fuel efficient. I don't think it makes sense for the government to allow the auto industry to go down the drain with 3 million jobs and all of the secondary impacts just because the current executives happen to be fools.
General Motors is advertising as the key to their future the Chevrolet Volt, which Congress has already voted a $7,500 tax credit to try and bribe purchasers into buying a car that otherwise they won't buy. Now, this is not a sustainable business model.
Well, go ahead. Well, consumers were lined up to buy the EV1 in 1996, and instead of investing in production of those cars, they invested in bribing the head of the authority.
It cost them $35,000 more to make it than they could sell it for. You can't make that up in volume, Bob.
Well, you can make it up in volume, actually. If you refine the technology, you slide down the cost curve, you reduce your unit costs. This is what the Japanese did, but they were smarter than we were.